I'm meeting today with Nathanael Player, and he is the director of the Utah State Law Library and also the director of the Self-Help Center there at the courthouse in Salt Lake City, the Matheson Courthouse. He's going to talk to us today about something that UFL-TV learned about, which is a study being conducted by Harvard University's Access to Justice Lab about remote participation in court proceedings by pro se litigants in Utah. Is that correct?
It's a little more nuanced than that. The study looks at hearings that are remote versus hearings that are in person on the pro se calendar and is trying to see, is there a difference in how those cases shake out? Not looking at substantive issues, but looking at time to disposition. How long does it take a case to get to a resolution? And then following up on the study, the randomized control trial part of the study, it's a randomized control trial. So half the cases are remote, half the cases are in person. It's randomized based upon case number, which is random. And then the cases have been running, the study's been running for about a year. Once the randomization part ends, the study will run for another year to just track what happens in those cases. So the first part is, how long does it take to get to a resolution in the case? And then the second part is, what happens after that? I'm going to use a word like durability. How durable is that order? Do people need a petition to modify? Motion to modify? Do they need a motion to enforce? So those are sort of indicators that maybe it wasn't fixed the first time. We didn't get it right the first time when we were trying to resolve the issue.
I'm a lawyer myself. I do nothing but domestic relations work and an occasional criminal defense related to things like protective orders or domestic violence and things like that. So my guess is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that what they're trying to do is find out, well, when people have to show up in court, do they often miss court because they couldn't make the bus or their car broke down, things like that? Is that one of the things they're wondering about? Is like, can we make it easier for people to get to the hearings and therefore we can move things faster in that regard? Is that one of the factors they're looking at?
Yeah, I think, the study started over a year ago, was conceived of when we were still in the pandemic and there were no in-person hearings, and it was inconceivable that we would have in-person hearings. And at the time, there were a lot of questions around, well, what kind of cases should be in person? What kind of cases should be remote? How should we think about proceeding? And so we had been talking with Harvard's Access to Justice Lab. They are sort of the experts in doing randomized control trials and bringing this sort of evidence-based practice into the legal system. And talking with the third district commissioners, especially Commissioner Sagers, about it, we sort of said, this could be a neat thing. Do you want to try it? Yeah. And they said, yes. I mean, actually, I'm not aware of anyone else in the country who's doing what we're doing in terms of a randomized control trial to really look in a long-term way about what's happening with these cases.
That was the question I was going to ask. So is it just a study involving Utah, or is it part of, one of several states that's part of the study?
This specific study is unique to Utah, yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So as I said, I was wondering if one of the things was, if they talk about if this facilitates or expedites the disposition of cases, is one of them the idea that people will be less likely to miss a court date if they can participate remotely? Is that one of the things they're asking?
I think that's one of the things they're asking. There is some data that already shows that in the eviction context, what a study out of Philadelphia shows is that the farther somebody is from the courthouse, the more likely they are to miss a hearing. And it's sort of, for every 8 minutes farther away from the courthouse you are on public transportation, the percentage likelihood that you will appear at the hearing goes down. So there already is some evidence to suggest that. One of the things the court has to do is it has to factor its own needs for efficiency and optimizing resources with the need for the public for it to be comfortable and accessible. And so I think that a lot of people who are judicial officers find that it's easier to do things in person. There's a lot of technical issues and there's a lot of communication that happens directly in person. There's eye contact, there's body language. You don't get that benefit when you're online, right?
So one of the things they're saying is that we're trying to find out if although I think everybody would agree in most cases it's more convenient for the participants to meet by remote proceedings, does it actually save time, or do they waste time, or do they end up having to take more time either in the form of longer hearings or multiple hearings, which to me seems counterintuitive, but it's obviously a great question, right? Because they said, we figured our working hypothesis was it would do X, but it turns out not to have done X. It did something completely opposite, or it did X plus or X minus. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, so and that's the joy of it. It's a randomized controlled trial, so we could actually look at the two different modalities, online or in person, and look at what's happening. So it is beyond dispute at this point. Everybody agrees that it is harder for the court to do things remotely. It's not as efficient for them. It takes more time, and so. But we know it's easier for the public, so those sort of things are in tension, right? It's easier for the public; they don't have to take time off of work. I think we're going to, as time goes on, get more clarity around what kinds of hearings, what kinds of issues are better for one modality versus the other. But the study's a little, at its most basic level, a little more general than that, just sort of saying
Sure.
what's better. But the other thing is this sort of time of disposition is something everybody cares about, but how durable the order is in the form of a modification or an enforcement action also matters. And
I was going to
that's
move to that next. So what were the initial concerns or maybe the anecdotal evidence about durability? And for those that are watching, I think you made it clear. What they were saying is, well, when you participate remotely, do you end up coming up with orders that aren't as holistic or aren't as comprehensive, aren't as well thought out, so that there is an order issued, but then people come back tending to seek modifications or clarifications of them? Do they do that more or less often depending upon whether they appear remotely? Is that the general question?
That is the question. And I don't know that anybody has a good working hypothesis because it's still relatively new and because no
Yeah.
one's done this kind of analysis before.
Yeah, I mean, those are two very good questions, because I think it's interesting that it seems to me that I'll bet you there are people that have very, I won't say strong, but very clear opinions where there's like, well, of course it works this way. And others like, no, of course it works that way. So that will be interesting to see what the study shows us, depending upon how it's conducted or how accurate it might be, as to whether they say, well, and as you point out, what we obtain by way of convenience is offset by perhaps the number of times it takes longer. We have longer hearings. We have multiple hearings as opposed to appearing in person, or we have orders that end up being, for one reason or another, not as good as if they appear in person. Or perhaps they will find, no, I mean, overall, there's a statistically insignificant effect. It'll be interesting to find out what that is. And it was Utah's idea then to go to Harvard and say, we have some questions that we think that other jurisdictions might find interesting, or how did that arise?
I mean, we had been working on a previous study with Harvard and their Access to Justice Lab. So it was sort of in the works that we were talking about randomized control trials. And then we had been working on a study in the context of debt collection eviction cases and notice to parties. And then the pandemic happened and the entire study sort of fell apart or became more difficult to administer because of the challenges around the pandemic. But this question is something that the court has been thinking about. And I think we're sort of where we are now, but at the time we were looking for more and more information, looking at what other jurisdictions have been doing to understand, like, in-person versus remote, how do we do it? What should we do it? When should we use one tool versus the other? And so it did come from within the judiciary, yeah.
And will they be, as part of the study, will they be trying to determine what factors affect the the longueur, or the amount of time, and the durability? Will they be saying, it's like, not only did we find that one does or does not do the other, but we also discovered certain factors? Or are they just doing a study of how long it takes and how durable the orders are? Like, how granular are they getting?
I don't know yet. My understanding is that they have the ability to access other variables. Those are the main things that the study was designed around. So those should become clear, but there should be enough data gathered to at least get hints about other aspects. But it sort of is for the people who understand statistics and standard deviations and things like that to tell us what they feel confident about saying this is true from the data.
It's very interesting. Well, I appreciate your time that you've taken with us. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that have a lot of other questions on the subject, but if they want to know more, do you know who they can inquire with? And you've already mentioned that they will finish gathering the data in September. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then they're going to take is my understanding, and doing my research leading up to this interview, that they're going to take about a year. And when they say about a year, that could be longer, but about a year's time to then review the data before they publish their findings. Is that your understanding as well?
Not exactly. So the study is a 2-year study. There's 1 year of randomization and then 1 year of observation. So during the 1 year, first year, there are the cases that are in person, the cases that are remote, and they're tracking those. And then the second year, they're not adding any new cases to the study. But that second year, they're just observing those cases to see who needed a modification or an enforcement action in either a set of data to look at that. And so it's not that it will take them that long to crunch the numbers, it'll take them that long to have observed long enough to see how the things are shaking out.
That's interesting. My last question is like, are there significant costs in something like this? Is like when Harvard gets involved, does that mean that they spend some of their money, or do they say, well, we'll do the analysis if the state will fund the study itself and provide the data? I mean, how does that work?
What's amazing is that Harvard was able to do its own fundraising. So the cost was zero to the courts, to the taxpayers.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And then they just will publish this and use that in their, I guess they'll use that as they see fit to help other jurisdictions as well as Utah to understand the data, and maybe that can be used for policy and rulemaking in the future. Thanks very much. Is there anything else that you think people would be interested to know or should know about the study before we conclude today?
There is a CLE we're looking at doing for members of the bar that we're hoping to schedule in mid-September. The 2 people working on the study, Renee Dancer from Harvard, is going to be here. There's another component regarding qualitative people's perceptions of how they felt, how fair they felt, how much voice they had in the process. And Emily LaGrada is sort of the expert on that piece. We're hoping to put together a CLE in September, so there will be messages going out to the bar once we get that scheduled.
Thanks so much. We appreciate the time and we appreciate the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.